I'm Emma Roberts, and my mother is Dorothy Masters, of course, and this is a presentation to show you a little bit of the family history about where the Masters came from and how they moved to Pontypridd. So, I'm going to take you through some interesting information. Let's see what you think of this. So, we're going to start here then with James and Sarah Masters. Okay, so you can see the dates there. And what we know from these two is that he lived a lot longer. She died quite young, 48. He was a widower for quite a long time. This is back in 1841. And as you can see from this census here, they're born and lived in South Petherton. So I'm going to show you a bit about that. This is where the family came from, and going back generations before for both James and Sarah Ann, they're in South Petherton in Somerset. So you can see from this, he is the head of household, um, and they've already got 10 children, and they're agricultural labourers. So in this census, 1881, they have children ranging from 20 years old to 1 years old. And then 7 years later, Sarah Ann dies. So whether that's because of childbirth or some other reason, I don't know. So you can see another little detail from this. While that the men are agricultural labourers, which mean they didn't own the land, they weren't owning the farm or running the farm, they were workers for other people's farms. And you can see down the bottom there's a glover. So the women in the family were glovers, and the men in the family were agricultural labourers. And it is quite significant that the children there, the younger children under the age of 10, were in school. That's not to be taken for granted at that time. And then you can see then, in terms of our connection down to my family, we know of Alf, that was William Benjamin Masters, who we'll come to. He was known as Alf. And you can see that his father's John, age 16, is in that. So we'll come back to those names now, but we're going to start off talking about this James and Sarah Ann who lived in South Petherton. So let's look at what that means then. So just outside of South Petherton is a place called Stratton, and that is actually where they lived. And would you believe it? There is a farm workers' cottages building which has started out as a farm. It became farm workers' cottages, and it's bound to be where they lived. And it's now turned into the pub called the Royal Oak. So amazingly, this building still exists, and I'm going to go to visit that. So they might have some pictures or videos or whatever from there. But it might be interesting to think about, well, what kind of farmers were they? What kind of work were they doing? And, there's a little bit of detail there from various sources about the kinds of ploughing and the kind of wheat and beans, flax, turnips, and clover. So that's quite interesting. But that's all of those names of the places are evident throughout all of these documents, really. So where is that then? Well, it is in a place called South Petherton. So it's just outside Yeovil in Somerset. Um, and that's, if you want to look on the map, is look at Yeovil, and then you'll see a little bit to the west of that is South Petherton, and follow the road south, and you'll see a very small place called Stratton. And nowadays it's called Over Stratton. And it's basically a single street. Over Stratton, as it says there, it's a single street consisting of a few 17th and 18th century houses, and that's basically what it still is. And then there's Stratton Farm and Yeybridge Farm, and there's a few different places like that. Um, and you can see that in 1656, Petherton was described as a market town of 300 families, and between 1801 and 1851, it rose rapidly to around 2000, and then I think it's perhaps falling again now. And you can see in this little detail here of the kinds of street names across Petherton. those are kind of familiar places like Church Path and Rigborough and Yeybridge, Lower Stratton. All of those places are evident through the census information for this family. So what was happening in South Petherton back in kind of the 1700s and 1800s? I won't say too much about this because this is kind of the background to it, but you can see names like Moody and I don't know how you pronounce that. Do you say the X? Vauxhall, I don't know. Maybe it's Vox. Those are names that come up, especially as the masters, when you go back the male line, they married into these kinds of families. So you see the name of Moody and Vox in that respect. And then another interesting detail from this British History website is that in 1867 there were bread riots. Now that's basically, you know, people rioting because of food prices and hunger, I suppose, and people feeling that they were um, profiteering, prices being too big, too high. And then there's a little bit of detail there about the trades that were around. And although they were in agriculture, like I say, the women were actually in gloving. And it's interesting that there was a glover in this area. So William Glover in 1644, actually, perhaps he was one of the leading tradesmen. But anyway, they set up factories, and you can see in 1871, Richard Southcombs established a gloving factory. Um, by 1851, the most widespread industry was gloving, employing 434 women and children. So that is what the Masters family were doing. And in this little map here, it's from the 70s, you can start to see the location of the various chapels. There's the main church of St. Peter and Paul, where some of the marriages took place, but also there's a lot of different types of chapels, as you can see, as you go through that period in different locations around the area. So we'll come back to the chapels because, as we know, the masters in Pontypridd were going to the Baptist church, so it'll be interesting to look at where that came from. Um, but let's first of all talk about the bread riots. Um, and basically, James Masters, who is the hero of the story that I'm telling here, when he was 27, was involved in these riots, and he was remanded to Taunton jail. And then he was sentenced to 6 months hard labour at Shepton Mallet. Um, and his father, William Masters, who at the time was 68, was also involved in the rioting. And he was bailed. He wasn't remanded, so he was able to. I suppose they thought he was too old, perhaps, to be in the prison conditions, whereas James was maybe a bit of a troublemaker and a bit hot-headed. I've no idea, but he was in fact sentenced as well as a 68-year-old to 2 months hard labour at Taunton jail. And you can see yeah, a few documents. The top one there is his release. So James being released on the 30th of June 1868, he spent those 6 months all through the winter in hard labour at Shepton Mallet prison. And that was the charge, rioting and demolishing the windows of the dwelling house of John Anstey and of certain other dwelling houses. And you can see it's not quite so easy to read, but the his father was also uh, charged and convicted of rioting and demolishing windows of some other houses in South Petherton. So quite a story, I suppose. And then I just thought you might be interested to see what the conditions of the jails were at the time. And what exactly does hard labour in the jail system look like? Well, you can see on the right there, Taunton Jail is where they both experienced some time there. And at Shepton Mallet, that is where James did his 6 months. So in 1823 in Taunton Jail, a tread wheel was introduced and it was to grind wheat and corn. But in actual fact, as it makes the point, is that the treadmill was actually for punishment. So didn't really matter if it achieved anything or not. But you can see that they did actually put one in to grind some corn as well. And it says that actually the Taunton prison was closed in 1884. You can see down the bottom there was some prison reformers, John Howard and Elizabeth Fry. They visited the Taunton jail, and they weren't very impressed. Um, and the male and female prisoners, he found them mixing, which of course is dangerous for the women. Um, and there were smaller rooms with beds that prisoners with money could pay for. I doubt very much that James was paying for that, but who knows? And a prison chaplain had been appointed, but he never turned up. Um, so you can see here that there is actually a reason for that prison to actually close down. But Shepton Mallet stayed open, and for the 6-month sentence, James was sent there, and you can see there was oakum picking. I haven't looked up what that is. The crank and the treadwheel. So, and they say you can still see the treadwheel building at Shepton Mallet Prison. And there was also a very curious and grim system introduced in the 1800s, which might have been something they experienced, which is the silent and separate systems, and really keeping people in complete isolation. It was outlawed eventually as a form of torture, of course. So who knows what they suffered in there? Um, but he was quite young, 27, but his father was 68. So let's move on to a happier topic then, the churches. And one of the things that I suppose I wanted to just point out is that obviously the Church of St. Peter and St. Paul, right in the middle of South Petherton, that would have been a big deal, if you like. But what was interesting, given what we know about the family becoming Baptist, is that at this time that the family were in the area, there was a particular parish priest who was very enthusiastic, and I suppose theologically that wasn't particularly accepted, and he subsequently became a leading Methodist. So I think this is really probably quite significant in the development of the religious side of the Masters. So this Thomas Coke then split off. I suppose he was chucked out, and he was removed as a curate in 1777, and it was because he was actually so popular. Okay, so the if you look at the census here. In 1851, the morning congregation was 237, 200 people in Sunday school. The afternoon attendance was 400 people, with 237 people in school. So a very, very thriving church there. And then what happened after that period is that other chapels then started to come onto the scene. And I won't read through some of this detail here, but Protestant non-conformity actually became a big deal. So people started to rebel against the Church of England, and all of these different chapels were brought up were built. So the independence, there was something called the Old Meeting, which is I think still visible as a building. And then there were some evangelical and Methodists and Bible Christians, etc. So I thought it would be quite interesting to think about and see if I could find any evidence of where did the masters attend church or chapel. And I haven't been there yet, but I'm going to go to that cemetery, see if there's anybody in the cemetery. And of course, there's the Reverend Coke Memorial Methodist Chapel. And I think that's really interesting because, like I say, knowing what we know about the Mesters, I think they were likely to become Methodists at this time and Protestant nonconformist. So when you look through all of the records, you can see huge numbers of records. They're not all there, but I went through and looked in the 16 to 1800s through the old meeting chapel, and I found no masters either buried, married, or christened there. Then I looked at the congregational chapel, and again, now who knows, I might have missed them, but I could find no names of masters buried, married, or christened through the dates that I could find access to in the congregational chapel. What I did find, though, so this is the South Petherton Congregational Church, First conducted in the Roundwell Street Chapel, and you can see there there's some of the names of the ministers, and sometimes you can find those names crop up in some of the documents. So, for example, here you can see in that particular entry there, you can see the name of the curate. It's not one of those, it's a different church. So, or wherever it's been done, maybe it was done in the parish church at that point. That was the birth certificate, look, of Elizabeth Masters, daughter of Thomas and Elizabeth. This is back now in the 1700s. So, sorry, the 1800s. So have a look at that list on the left-hand side. The Sunday school of the Congregational Church, I found one Masters. And again, because the Masters in Pontypridd was so involved in the chapel, the Calvary, they were involved in the Sunday school. So I thought, well, that's interesting. Who is that E Masters? The only E Masters I could find, as I say, was this Elizabeth Masters. Thomas's wife would have died by the time this was in 1871, so, and she died in 1856. But her daughter, Elizabeth Masters, and I couldn't find anywhere of her being married, but that might come out in due course, was Elizabeth Masters, and she would have been 54 in 1871, and that would have been Alf's great-grandfather's youngest sister. Now, it's not likely to be the case because I do think that E Masters is most likely to be male because they would normally put Mrs. or Miss next to a female. So that E Masters in the Sunday school teachers list is not somebody I could track down. But what we do know is that there's a huge number of masters who were not related. You know, our line comes down, and there's a huge number of cousins called masters. So, look, where did I find some success? Well, where I did find a lot of masters was at the South Petherton Wesleyan Chapel. All right, so the current church built in the Cork Memorial Methodist Church was built in 1882. So it's a new building built in 1882. And you can see here the Wesleyan Chapel Methodist, the records from 1813 to 1906. Here are some masters. Now again, none of these are identifiable to me, but I found some in the Wesleyan Chapel. So I think this is different somehow from the Congregational Chapel. This is the Wesleyan Methodist tradition. So that is perhaps where they worshipped. As I say, none of those names are people that I could identify, but there was only a short segment of the records available. But more masters anyway in that particular chapel, as I guessed. So let's have a think then about what happened next. There's a really interesting bit of the story about how they ended up in South Wales. And the first thing that I wanted to show you was James himself, after his wife has died. So his wife died, Sarah Ann died in 1888. She's only aged 48. 3 years later, in the 1901 census, there is actually an entry for a James Masters who is in Aberdare. Now, is that likely? Well, one of the things that I wanted to think about was, well, what would that would have been like? All his children are grown up, or at least he's got older daughters who are perhaps looking after them. And if you look at the figures of males employed in agriculture in Somerset, there was a decline starting. Okay, so between 1881 it was 25%, and actually by 1901 it was dropping. And of course, as an older man, maybe he felt that he had opportunities elsewhere. And perhaps he was worried about how his sons were going to maintain their livelihoods. So by 1911, we've got him back in South Petherton. He's living with his daughter Emily, and as it says there, he goes on to live until he's 73, but he dies back in South Petherton. But perhaps this is him. Perhaps this is him. It says he's from Somerset and Yeovil, which it seems very likely, and he's a stonemason. Now, what I think is interesting is it likely he's 60 years old and he's working as a stonemason? Is it likely that an agricultural labourer had the skills to become a stonemason in Aberdare? And I think possibly there is a very good reason why you might think that that is possible, because the Aberdare population was growing hugely, so there's a huge amount of building works, huge amount of stone work required, building of stone walls, building, shaping them, getting them, and building them, quarrying them. And what you can see here is that whereas we saw the agricultural figures for employment decline over this period, you can see that the quarrymen employment is increasing through this period. And you can see both the Somerset numbers is doubled from 1,126 males employed in quarrying in Somerset in 1881, and that grew to 2,285 by 1901. So if he was involved in that, he could possibly have taken his agricultural labouring skills, working on stone, maybe building dry stone walls, and then become expert enough to then move down to Glamorganshire. And as you can see in Glamorganshire, it's moved from 876 in 1881 and it's risen by over 1,000. So I suspect that that is what I think is probably has happened. He's come down to work there. And as you can see, in the 10 years from 1881 to 1891, net migration to Glamorgan was over 76,000 people, 63% of which was from the non-border counties of England. So, the the counties coming from Somerset. So that's what I suggest he did. So what's interesting then is you've actually got by 1901 he's in Aberdare being a stonemason, and this is the period at which his son John Masters, who in 1881 was still working on the farm in South Petherton, but by the time he gets to 1886 he's in Cardiff and he's married Phoebe Goodfield. Now, Phoebe is from Pontypridd, but they says that they marry in Cardiff. That might be a detail that's not quite right. Um, but she's a Welsh speaker, so she can speak both. You can see in the entry there that she speaks both, whereas obviously John Masters is an English speaker, and they already have some children. They're living in 11 Danagraig Street. I think at some point the part of the family live in number 10, but it seems at this point he's in number 11. And there's a picture of it there. Just a typical Pontypridd house. But if you have a look at this detail of this 1901 census, it's really interesting. So John is a coal miner. His father's a stonemason, but he's found work in the mines as a coal miner, as is his son Edward, age 14. Alf, who we know, this is William Benjamin, so this is our ancestor. Alf is an errand boy, age 12. Okay, and I think it is noticeable that none of the younger children are in school. And you can see that only a few generations before they have been going to school. But at this point, these young people are working. So it's a pretty hard life actually. And there you can see in the family tree diagram there, down the bottom is William Benjamin, so that's Alf. And then I've spoken about John Masters, his father, who's come to be a coal miner, but really was working on the farm in South Petherton. And above that in the male line, James Masters, who we kind of started off this story with, who spent a long time as an agricultural labourer and ended up as a stonemason in Aberdare, but then went back. So you can see how the whole family came down. He helped perhaps set this family of his son John set up here, and then he went back to live with his eldest daughter Emily back in South Petherton. So you can see here all of the others, the ancestors, and if you want to find out more about that, obviously I've got more of those links being made. And the stories go right back to the 1600s, so so there you go. I hope you find that interesting.